This week, Emmet talks with Brian Cremins, who previously appeared in episode 539 to discuss his book Captain Marvel and the Art of Nostalgia. This time they're talking about last year's film Shazam. Which elements came from the original C.C. Beck comics and which were from Jeff Johns' more recent books? Where did the horror elements come from? Should Dwayne Johnson have played the hero, or maybe he already has? And yes, you might be better served to watch the film before listening to this episode. First, just a reminder that you can help this podcast by making your Amazon purchases via deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon and make that your bookmark for future purchases. Deconstructing Comics earns a bit of money from your purchase that helps us keep the show going. We really appreciate your support. This is Tim, and this is Deconstructing Comics.
This is Emmet for Deconstructing Comics here in Melbourne, and I today am talking to Brian Cremins, who we've had on before, the author of Captain Marvel and the Art of Nostalgia, and I decided to invite Brian back on the show because a year ago, a little movie called Shazam came out, realized for the first time on the big screen, unless you count those serials from back in the 30s, the adventures of Shazam, formerly known as Captain Marvel. And I thought, who better to have on the show than the man who wrote what I consider to be one of the definitive works on the character, but also a comics history that managed to blend memoir and comics history itself in a way that I think even Grant Morrison's Supergods failed to do. I don't know if that's too aggressive a comparison to make, Brian. How do you feel about that?
No, I think I'm very happy to hear that. You know, as an Alan Moore acolyte, I think that he would be happy to hear that as well.
Good man. Because I thought I've seen Supergods referenced academically, and I have an issue with that because I think a lot of it is personal, subjective opinion, but you know, very, very interestingly phrased and parlayed in the work itself. Morrison is a good writer, and he clearly very serious thinker on comics. But I thought what you managed to do was a far more impressive fusion of that attempt at memoir and comics history. And I think I said to you before in our interview that your book was just such an enjoyable read, but I learned so much about Binder and Beck, and it wasn't just a superficial tragedy of these frustrated artists being screwed over by big business. There was actually some insight into what they were doing and how they made a crust and how much they cared passionately about this work they were doing in Captain Marvel.
Yeah, no, thank you, and I appreciate that, because that was really part of the goal of that book, was to get that personal element. Not only in the way that I approached it and in writing about myself, but also particularly about them, because like you said, they were really engaged and serious about the work. And I will say that's one thing, as we start to talk about the film, that I did think, you know, the production people and the writer and the director did capture pretty well. It did have that sense of engagement that I think they did in the original comics, which I was not expecting when we walked into that theater.
Yeah, I was going to actually touch on that. Well, just throw that in for you as well, because I kind of feel within popular culture there aren't those same iconic moments from the history of the character that, say, you have with Batman, you know, the shooting of the parents, the pearls flying in the air, or Superman, the rocket ship flying out of space and being discovered in a farm by two ranchers. Like, you don't have that with Captain Marvel, even though he has this extraordinary origin with the subway train and everything. So little nods to that in the film were welcome, but I was surprised that they did try and blend aspects of the classic run with more contemporary takes on Shazam, the Jeff Johns run, for example.
Yeah. And someone who worked on it did their research too, because there's a lot of references, even to Beck. There's the reference to his hometown. I don't know if you remember the sequence where Billy finds his mother in the public housing, and I think it's in that sequence where one of them mentions the fact that his missing father was born in Zumbrota, Minnesota, where Beck was born, and is now either in jail or exiled somehow in Florida. So that's clearly an embedded Beck reference, which I was not expecting to hear in there.
Yeah. I did some research on that, and from what I can gather, the C.C. Beck character, C.C. Batson, rather, sorry. So he's named after C.C. Beck. C.C. Batson is Jerry Ordway's contribution for the powers of Shazam. And that's back in the 80s.
Oh, okay.
And Jeff Johns has taken it up in his current run on the character. So he's reintroduced this character of Billy Batson's biological father, an ex-con, coming to find him to try and restore his relationship with his son.
Oh, I see. Okay.
I do wonder, the one thing I didn't make a note of was his birthplace. And you're saying that is Beck's actual birthplace. Oh, interesting.
That's Beck's actual birthplace. Yeah, that's since I don't know the Ordway run that well, I don't know if he was the one that introduced that. It wouldn't surprise me given what a great fan he is, the original stuff. But the fact that it was then mentioned in the film, those specific geographic locations, and the fact that he ends up like Florida as Beck did, I thought was an interesting nod. Aside from the fact that Savannah's father also is clearly, the actor looks a lot like 70s Beck in a kind of very stereotypical kind of way.
Yeah, and he's also been Lex Luthor's father on Smallville, so he's gotten around.
That's right.
Mr. Glover.
That's right. Yeah.
So we've already digressed a bit, but I did want to open up by asking you, I think you've touched on this already, but did you like the film, Brian? Did you like Shazam?
I did enjoy the film, and what's been unusual about it is that outside of a couple of close friends, I haven't met anyone else that's really enjoyed it. I've had I've had a couple of instances where I was, or I offered to write an essay on it. It was turned down because it wasn't thought there was actually enough interest in it. Even when we went to see it, it was during the ICAF comics conference last year, and initially I had a couple of friends at the conference who said, I think I'd like to see the movie with you, but then they sort of backed out at the last minute and kind of admitted that they weren't interested. So there didn't seem this groundswell of interest in it, at least in the circles of people that I know.
Right. And again, I guess that goes back to what we touched on before, which is he, as a character, no longer has that popular purchase on the attention of the paying public. Audiences aren't going to flock to see a Shazam movie. Even the fact that we have this confusion, and I've done at least two episodes for this podcast about Captain Marvel Shazam, because I really want to imprint on people, I love this character. I love talking about this character. I love the idea of this character. But the fact that I keep needing to correct myself on what the character is called, that for me is a problem. It's Shazam, but we know him as Captain Marvel. I thought it did reasonably well because, I guess this is Hollywood economics. It's considered a successful film because they didn't spend a lot of money making it, comparatively with the other DC movies. Right. It's not as big an affair, and it made back its budget, and it was popular enough. But yeah, I guess people were lining up in the street to see it, which is a shame because I think it's a very pleasant film.
Yeah, no, I agree, and that's what I thought. I think what was interesting too is the people. Going back to some of the ideas in my book, the people that I thought would have sort of enjoyed it, which are those who are actually nostalgic for the character because they read it, at least in the 40s and early 50s. Those have been some of the folks I know who really like it the least. So clearly, I think any success it's had has not been because of any nostalgia that might be driving some, to some extent, some of the Marvel movies. Because I think the people that did know the character originally didn't particularly find it appealing, and then maybe just introduced it to a new kind of generation of fans who aren't familiar with it.
Yeah. Yeah, and on that note, what I found interesting about the film overall was the director, David F. Sandberg, who I believe also performs as Mr. Mind in the film.
Okay. I didn't realize that.
I wonder if he does the voice, yeah. What I found interesting about his approach to Shazam and how it relates to your book is that I think it's chock full of nostalgic references to films from the 80s. So he leans into this sort of Spielbergian horror for kids.
Yeah.
A lot of people who I've heard talk about this movie have talked about how there is surprising amounts of horror in it, and it reminds me of movies like Poltergeist or Indiana Jones.
Oh yeah.
You know, where you have people like rotting or being destroyed or being melted. There's a lot of that going on.
Right.
And then you've got the sequence where Savannah and Shazam are fighting in a toy store, and it's the piano dance scene from Big, you know.
Oh, definitely. Yep. Oh, and even for me, I don't think this was directly and maybe intentional, or I don't know if it was a direct allusion, but the sort of training sequence that Shazam has after he learns that he has these powers, and it's a Queen song in the background. So I just immediately thought of Flash Gordon, you know, the 1980 film, which is still one of my favorites.
Yes.
Which is probably not intentional, but I think my enjoyment of the film was that it kind of had that feeling that it felt like a fusion of Flash Gordon and My Bodyguard, which I don't know if you remember that film from the late 70s, which was just about it's set in Chicago actually, and it's a kid, you know, who is getting bullied, and so one of the sort of tough kids at the high school sort of befriends him, and it forms into an unlikely friendship. So in my mind, the Shazam film was a fusion of those more realistic films from the 70s, and then something, you know, ridiculous but amazing like Flash Gordon.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're right. There is this sort of looking backward towards the 70s and 80s in the film and how it's structured, and even the idea of these two kids just goofing off for a good half an hour. Yeah. Billy and Freddie just having fun with the powers.
Because of sequences like that, what you mentioned about the kind of the horror aspects of it, particularly the scene when those creatures, you know, get the rest of the board at the Savannah, you know, the Savannah business. That sort of struck a slightly off note to me, you know, because I think I enjoyed the interactions of the characters and the centering of the family more than I did those kind of elements. And I wasn't sure where, you know, that was coming from. Is that another sort of reference to some of the more recent comics, or a use of some of those qualities from the recent books?
Yeah, I've read the recent Jeff Johns run, which has almost beat for beat the same plot. So clearly what's happened here is the studio has hired a screenwriter to take the recent comic run, so you've got no issue with Estates or Binder and Beck's families, or like similar to the situation with the Superman families.
Yeah, right.
And they've taken this recent storyline and they've just mapped it onto the screen. So in the comics, in the comics, there is this sequence where the sins are all like attacking people, hurting people. One of the characters who's not in the film, he's the father of the two bully kids. Remember the two rich kids who are bullies? Yeah. So in the comics, there's a father figure.
Oh, sure.
And he gets converted. He gets turned into a monster by the sins, and so there's this emphasis on body horror and violence and death, which is from the current comics. And
I was wondering, because that's the element that's definitely not from those originals, and so that explains that other strain that I felt in it.
Yeah, and Sandberg seems to take that, like he's been given this is what he has to put on film. And he takes it, and because he's also a horror filmmaker, he realizes it. But I thought the design of the monsters was similar to, again, those Oogie Boogies from the 80s, like your sort of greasy, oily monsters, like your Gremlins, your Ghoulies, and whatever else. Like these 80s video store nasties. Because in the comics, the sins are actual. They're human. They're more humanoid, and I think, is it Lust is like this beautiful woman, and there's even a line in this film where somebody says, "Oh, I would have thought you'd be more attractive," you know, and but in this movie they're monstrous. So Sandberg, I think, is like tipping his hat again to the 80s there. But yeah, that sort of dissonant element of horror.
Yeah.
Because I think we touched on this when we talked about Captain Marvel before, that if you go through the old run, there are scary stories. And of course, in your research, you remember you covered that whole period where they were trying to cater to the horror audience. So you actually had Captain Marvel horror stories or scary stories.
Oh, absolutely. And those, the scary stories, which I'm remembering now some of that, that's in some of the Binder papers, that Beck was not interested in doing those. It was really Binder because he had that sense of the market in the way that Beck was sort of disdainful of. So there were some in the later, early 50s, as you said, to compete with the popularity of the EC books of the time.
Yeah. So I mean, what I took from that when I got that collection of classic Shazam where they did 75 years of Shazam or something, and you can see it's shifting to try and meet market demand and try and meet different audiences over the years, which of course all these comic characters had to do. But
yeah, exactly.
What I took from that was, of all the characters, because Captain Marvel Shazam exists on this sort of crux between fantasy and the supernatural and myth and all these things.
Yeah.
With the possible exception of Wonder Woman, I think Captain Marvel Shazam is perfectly suited for. You can do horror stories. You can absolutely do stories that make children afraid, because it's still a boy in there. Billy still has all these anxieties of a child, and you could do that kind of thing. I felt within the film, it was too jarring to cut from one. As you said, that you've got these scenes of this warm family, this warm and loving family. I'd love to talk about the foster family and all of them in the film. And then you cut to a woman being licked by a giant demon before it murders her. Like, really disturbing.
Yeah. And those are exactly. Those are the really jarring parts of the film. And when we went to see it, I even though I enjoyed it, I kept trying to wonder what Harlan Ellison would have thought if he had, had he lived to see it. I would have loved to have asked him what he thought of it, because I can only imagine what he would have said about these, those particularly 80s-looking demons.
Yeah,
I don't think he would have been pleased.
Yeah, have you encountered Harlan Ellison in the past? Have you met him?
When I actually, for the research for the nostalgia book, I did a pretty extensive interview with him that ended up in the last chapter, in chapter 5, but the whole interview got published in the FCA area of Alter Ego a couple of years ago. But I had talked to him when I was in high school. That's would be a bit of a tangent, but I'd written a letter to the Comic Buyer's Guide and had mentioned a couple of his stories. And I ended up talking to him back then. He gave me a phone call after I sent him an article that I'd written for my high school newspaper. So we had a few encounters over the years.
Oh, wow. That's so cool. He's one of these figures who I think, he's this giant within the scene, because he would let you know what he feels about things.
Yeah. Yeah, he did. But I think I was partly watching the film through that lens, and I still write for faucet collectors, and that that audience that reads that magazine and reads Alter Ego as a whole it does skew older, and they're readers that some of whom read those comics in the first place. So I can't tell in some conversations I've had about it with that group of people. If it's the horror element, now that you mentioned it, that they're responding to negatively, or if it's that blending of that horror element with elements that are clearly from the original comics, like the family sequence. So I've never not quite sure, because I know in talking to Paul from Fawcett Collectors that Roy Thomas, who's the main editor for Alter Ego, was not a huge fan of it, but I haven't asked Roy yet specifically what he thought about it. I'm actually kind of curious to know more about that.
Yeah, and it's interesting as well, because I think of all the films from the DC universe that have come out, and I'm including the recent Birds of Prey movie, which I saw just the other week.
Yeah.
I feel Shazam is the one that has the most positive turn towards the character. There's this sense of warmth and the importance of family and the importance of friendship. These are all sincerely dealt with within the film. I think this is not superficial. Like the film is invested in this idea of a moral good from being with other people.
Right.
But a lot of these creators that you just mentioned in passing, I can see how they look on the general landscape of comics and can see a oppressive sense of ugly violence and ugly aggression that's sort of embedded into these texts. And you know, I think Geoff Johns is good at many things, and he's clearly captured the popular zeitgeist in a lot of his rebranding of classic superheroes. But I do feel he tends to lean on this crutch of shock violence a lot, and to diminishing returns. I saw something recently about, I think it was another classic comic creator was really upset about the Titans show, where again, they're all traumatized, cynical, hard-bitten. They're more like 1930s gumshoe detectives than superheroes.
I have a good friend who worked in the writers' room on that show, and I think had similar issues when she was working on it, from what I heard.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, because since she was a fan of the '80s run of the comics. Didn't agree with all the choices that they were having to follow for it. But I guess that's just part of that collaborative, Hollywood process where different compromises have to be made depending on what they, what is thought to be the target audience for it, right?
I wanted to quickly give a shout out as well to, because we brought up Harlan Ellison, his book on rock and roll Spider Kiss. I've always enjoyed that book.
Oh, Spider Kiss, sure.
In terms of, it's a book about a very cynical, manipulative, exploitative industry, and there's still a moral compass within the book. Like, it's not unpleasant for the sake of being unpleasant.
Right. And that was very much a lot of his other work too. I think always had that kind of quality. Even some of his more sort of violent stories, there was always that really centered sense. Yeah, some kind of like moral universe or purpose, right?
Yeah.
Which, again, I think that's the part of the film, and I don't want to speak for Harlan. I don't want him to come and haunt me, but I think that's the part of the film that someone like that would have probably enjoyed, because it did have that centered quality of that very diverse family that makes up the middle of the film. Yeah,
so one thing that John's introduced in the new comics run is this idea of Billy's foster family. And Rose and Victor are the parents, and they run this house with a bunch of foster kids. My favorite kid of them all is Darla, and she's played by Faith Herman in the film. Oh, she's a dote. Like, she's just adorable.
Yeah. No, she's fantastic.
But Mary is there as well. So. His sister Mary, and all the other kids. And what I just loved about that was this depiction of Rosa and Victor in particular being this loving couple. They just want a safe home for these kids. They want stability for these kids. And they have all these little rituals in the household to give these kids a sense of continuity and kinship.
Yeah.
And I thought that was the one aspect of the film for me that just really, really worked. And I even and let me run this by you. Throughout the film, there's these nods to Toki Tawny, and even the buckles on Shazam's costume have the tiger, and there's a little girl later on who has a toy tiger. So there's nods to the tiger.
Right.
I thought Victor was a bit tigerish.
Yeah, that's true. No, he is. That's true, actually. Right.
Yeah, he's just this big, warm.
On top of all those other references.
Yeah. I thought there's Toki.
Yeah. No, they clearly had woven him in there in a way that was effective. Actually, we kind of enjoyed what we saw, like trying to identify any of those references that we could get.
Yeah.
I think it's on the back of his backpack too. Billy's backpack has the tiger on the back of it, so that was woven in nicely.
And my concern about, and this is why I made a note of the CC Batson character. My concern is having introduced that Billy is able to meet his mother and put that storyline to rest, and then he rejoins his family. But having introduced this notion of CC Batson being out there in the world, I really hope that the sequel to this movie doesn't have this father character appear, because I love the continuity of the foster family within this film, and this idea of this is his true family now. So,
no, I hope they don't. I think that I think that with the success that it's had, it's clearly showed them, given how different the tone is from, like you said, the other DC films, that it worked for what it was, and it made its budget, so that probably, since Hollywood can be so formulaic, maybe they will stick to that as something they see as kind of the strength of the film.
Yeah, my worry is because it's such a beat-for-beat recreation of the comics film that Jeff Johns did. In the Johns scripts, C.C. Batson does come back, and he becomes the seventh member of the Shazam family.
Oh, okay. All right, well, that'll be interesting.
And there was something in the comics as well that I don't think the film does, which is that whenever Billy shares his power with someone else, the respective powers of each member become weaker.
Oh, okay, interesting.
Yeah, which is kind of like Marvel have the there's a group of villains in the Marvel continuity called the Wrecking Gang, I think they're called, and they've got
the
Wrecking Crew, is it?
And it's the Wrecking Crew, yeah.
Yeah, they've stolen Thor's powers, or they've stolen some aspect of Thor's powers, and they can share them out amongst themselves. But each time they induct a new member into the crew, they each respectively has less power. So
less. Okay. Huh.
So So I kind of feel as if Johns has taken the Wrecking Crew and made it the Shazam family.
Fused it into these characters. It seems an unnecessary addition, to the old mythology. Given that a lot of these sort of Lieutenant Marvels and Uncle Marvel, they really didn't have any powers to begin with. They were just there because they were part of the group. They were part of the gang. They were the family. In the old comics.
Yeah, and of course Uncle Marvel, who just kept faking that he had powers.
Right. And they don't have the heart to tell him that he doesn't actually have any. Yeah.
Coming up, should Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson play Captain Marvel? Has he already done so in a non-Shazam movie? How does Shazam look alongside the other recent DC films? And more. I'm continuing to republish classic episodes of Deconstructing Comics in reverse order, unlocked by our patrons' generous support. This week's is number 68 from March 26, 2007, in which Brandon and I look at Charles Burns' Black Hole and Scott McCloud's take on the power of words. The classic episodes can be found on our Facebook and Twitter feeds by clicking on the earliest months listed on the left sidebar at deconstructingcomics.com, or in publicly available posts on our Patreon page or in the Patreon smartphone app. Classic episodes have been unlocked back to number 46. You can help to unlock earlier episodes by pledging. Check out all our goals and help us reach them at patreon.com/deconcomics.
You like cheap comic books, right? Well, I'm Professor Allen, and I talk about cheap comic books on the Quarterbin podcast. In every episode, I'll dissect a single comic from my collection, as long as I paid no more than 25 cents for the issue. Forget about $4 new comics that you can read in 4 minutes, or crossover events that can cost $100 to collect. Join me in the Quarterbin, where even bad comics are a bargain, and good ones are a steal. The Quarterbin podcast is part of the Relatively Geeky Podcast Network. Visit us at relativelygeekypodcast.blogspot.com or search Relatively Geeky or Quarterbin Podcast in iTunes. I guarantee it'll be worth every penny.
Well, if you remember, last time we spoke, we got into a little bit digression about Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and his appearance as Black Marvel in a supposed upcoming sequel. And we were talking about how he's actually the perfect choice to play Shazam himself. In that he has this goodness about him in a lot of his cinematic characters, and this sense of being almost this warm, inviting personality, and he could play that quite well. So had Did you have the opportunity to check out his performance in Jumanji: Welcome to the Jungle and the recent sequel? Because I feel as if Dr. Bravestone basically is Captain Marvel.
Really? And I haven't seen the film yet. I mean, but so he does that kind of a character effectively then?
It's the exact same premise. In the film, these kids get sucked into, these teenagers get sucked into Jumanji. And when they arrive...
okay.
When they arrive in Jumanji, this young, nebbishy little boy becomes Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, Dr. Bravestone.
Oh, okay.
And his crisis over the two films, in fact, is that he enjoys being Bravestone more than he enjoys being himself. And having strength and power and confidence and charisma, and he keeps doing this thing where he raises his eyebrow and everyone flutters and goes, oh. So he's got natural sexual charisma as well.
Yeah.
And he starts to resent his sort of a teenage self, and he just wants to stay in the game and be Bravestone. And I feel like the Jumanji films are almost like a stealth version of Captain Marvel with The Rock.
With him, and because apparently he is going to play Black Adam. I think that's I forget the release date of the film, and I don't know if the plan is that comes out next, and then that ties into a Shazam sequel, or if that is part of the Shazam sequel. So I like Zach Levi as the character. I thought he did. He did a good job. I think I don't know if I've ever seen him in anything other than was it Chuck that he was in? I don't remember the TV series, but he doesn't have that kind of just like widescreen charm that the Rock has, and that the Rock can convey in that kind of a situation. So I still think, that would probably still be my dream casting. And now that you're telling me the backstory on C.C. Batson, I think I would choose Mickey Rourke to be the C.C. Batson father figure, and then put the Rock back in as as Shazam himself there.
You want Mickey Rourke to play C.C. Batson? Is that what you said?
Yeah, given this whole backstory, I just have a great affection for Mickey Rourke. I want him to play it the way he plays the character in The Wrestler, which is one of my favorite films. I say that because I think he's the villain in the second Iron Man film, right? Is that the one Rourke appears in? And he gives, again, like he does in a lot of his films, this long monologue at the beginning of that film that's more interesting probably in the rest of the whole piece. And I would love to see him do that. And as he does in The Expendables and those kind of films where they bring him out for 5 minutes and then he disappears again.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's an interesting idea. Yeah. And his little the way he kept referring to his my little bird was my little bird.
Right.
Iron Man 2.
Right.
That's an underrated film, in my opinion. I know it wasn't. It's regarded as one of the weaker Marvel entries, and I can understand why. But what's his name? The chap who's always dancing, Sam Rockwell. Sam Rockwell playing Justin Hammer.
Sam Rockwell, sure.
Yeah.
Right.
He gives these little speeches as well, which I really enjoy. So
right.
I did not mind that film. So no, I just wanted to bring up Jumanji: Welcome to the Jungle. I would recommend it if you haven't seen it, because again, it is very heartfelt. It's very sincere. It's fun. It's a very funny film. But it's also a film about wish fulfillment. And if we want to approach this theme of nostalgia again, I like that in the film Jumanji, the game, because it was a board game. Almost like a survival instinct morphs into a video game because it's more attractive to children as a video game than as a board game. And so it changes slightly with the times, but then when they interact with the game, they're back in this world full of like 1950s adventure serial tropes. Which I really enjoyed. So there's an element of nostalgia still at work there, and just with slight updates, but you can still channel that spirit. I did also want to quickly mention, did you notice in Shazam the nods to merchandise in universe, like superhero merchandise?
Yes, I did, and that was interesting. I think particularly with the Freddy character, right? The Freddy character is sort of the comics fan, right? And so no, there was sort of an interesting, kind of element to that which was sort of ironic too, given the fact that Fawcett had to be producing a lot of its own in-house merchandise in the 1940s because they couldn't get their licenses to other companies because other companies at the time were afraid of getting involved with them and then having to get DC or National on their backs from the lawsuit. So the fact that they're centering that character in the middle of this universe of DC merchandise, essentially, where they all look up to characters like Superman, is kind of an ironic turn in the canon, I guess.
And I also thought that Shazam as a film is carrying a lot of water for the DC movie universe because what had happened before is you have audiences become increasingly, I think, worn out by the violence and misery of the Justice League and Man of Steel and Batman vs Superman. Yeah. And we're led to believe in the world of Shazam that children will want to play with toy figures based on these characters who have destroyed whole cities.
Exactly, they've leveled everything in their path.
It's like no, I won't make that joke. Stop myself.
I mean, it's like in a roundabout way that it's almost at that point an adaptation of Miracle Man, right? Because you have like the destruction of London in issue 15, and so it's sort of embedded in that mythology, I guess.
Yeah, and within Miracle Man, there were teenagers who modeled themselves on the evil. Was it Kid Marvel or Kid Miracle Man?
It's Kid Miracle Man, Kid Marvel Man. Yeah, he's the one that he's never actually changed back or sort of had never said his magic word, and so grows up into that sociopathic kind of character. Yeah. So it was interesting that I don't think that was intentional on the part of the screenwriters, but it's sort of they sort of were almost gesturing towards that aspect, which I think we may have talked about last time. Is that the Miracle Man I think was the best modern take on that character and those set of characters, even though it's not innocent at all and it is hyper violent. But I think the sensibility that Moore, I think, seemed to understand about the characters was still there. That wish fulfillment, like you said, and the failure of the wish fulfillment and what that results in. I thought he touched on it really well in that book. So I could see maybe, to go back to what you said earlier about Jeff Johns and his run, a lot of what you described there sounds like a kind of hangover from that extreme kind of violence and cynicism of the 80s comics, when things suddenly, as they said, became adults or more mature at the time. And, where Hollywood is like 30 years late, especially, Warner Brothers, in sort of adapting that sensibility. Into these films, like you said, like Justice League and Superman versus Batman, which are exhausting, as you said.
Yeah, and even you cite how violent and dark the Alan Moore scripts were, but they still had enough of a moral compass to show teenagers hero worshipping this genocidal superhero as a bad thing.
Right.
Like there's these gangs dressing up like him, and this idea that you may have defeated Kid Miracle Man, Kid Marvel Man, but the impact he's had is going to continue, and there's a sort of trauma that's going to work out its way out in different ways, and some of the people are going to become villains as a result. But that was one of my favorite post-Moore Miracle Man stories is that Neil Gaiman issue. I don't know if we talked about this, where Andy Warhol is.
Oh, we did, right? I remember.
Yeah, I won't belabor the point, but I do love this idea of just the reproducibility of the superhero as a sort of icon.
Right.
And when you have Zachary Levi like picking up a giant inflatable Batman and throwing it at Mark Strong and all this stuff, and I was watching going, did you just have embedded advertisement in your film?
Right.
Is that what this is?
Well, that whole sequence is. exactly. The whole sequence in the, in the convenience store was was one long advertisement for the various products.
Yeah.
I don't remember if he drinks Coke or Pepsi, but that's sort of already embedded in there.
Because again, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop thinking, the people in this universe, I know this is Philadelphia, but it's not that far away from where Metropolis is supposed to be, have witnessed massive destruction at the hands of these so-called superheroes. And now somebody in this universe, some huckster, is selling toys based on their appearance. I just can't get over that.
Yeah. No, I know. I feel like they should have had like Dan Aykroyd with his character from Saturday Night Live who sells the bags of glass to kids. The parody of they should have brought him back out of semi-retirement to play that character. But because that's true. I mean, especially given how extremely grim those are. I mean, I suppose with Wonder Woman they sort of made a turn away from that.
Yes.
A little bit where they seem to find their footing because. Now I'm having memories of seeing the Superman film, the first of these newer ones with my dad, and he thought it was going to be like the 1978 Superman, and I warned him when we sat down. I said, this is not going to be like that. And halfway through, he said, this is horrible. It's so grim and depressing. I said, no, I told you this was not going to be Christopher Reeve and Margot Kidder, charming everyone for 2 hours.
Yeah, it was rough. I have a friend here, Frank Candelaro, and we went to see Man of Steel together, and they're a comic book artist, and I was sitting beside them and vibrating with anger throughout the film, just like I was almost like the Flash. I'm going to slip through the wall. I'm just going to vibrate through the wall just to get out of the cinema. Just the sheer non-stop violence, and I felt as if in Shazam, when Savannah, who's been empowered by the sins and he's now got superpowers himself, when they are fighting across the cityscape, and then Sandberg cuts away to a child, like mashing his two toys together, I felt there was a slight sort of not direct, an indirect criticism of Man of Steel there.
Yeah.
That here's a superhuman battle, and there's no collateral damage, really.
Right.
In fact, in the whole film, the worst it gets is they traumatize a Santa Claus actor.
That's right. That's right.
So
it's
this
the worst
kid,
outcome of all this.
Yeah. And his kid watching the spectacle of these two flying beings punching each other in the sky, and even that break for comedy where like Mark Strong is delivering his villain speech, and Zachary Levi's character can't hear him.
Right, which is another actually nice touch, I thought. Right.
It's just beautiful. So I feel as if this movie, and I'm repeating myself, I feel it's carrying water for the previous films and actually dragging them into this sense of like more positive values, more fun, more entertaining.
Yeah.
And that's a lot for a film to do, but I thought it actually managed to carry a lot of that off.
Yeah, and maybe the studios thought that would be possible because it really is a relatively, I won't say unknown, but lesser known character. So maybe they felt less precious about it because if it didn't do well, they didn't feel like they were losing anything for that particular property. Since again, it's not one that, that's at the level of the Batman or the Wonder Woman, or the Superman, where they have a lot of money on those. I mean, it's not, as you said at the beginning. When's the last time we even saw that character on the screen? There was I think, the 80s cartoon, and then, when I was a kid in the late 70s, there was the live action, TV show that was on CBS. But beyond that, there's a good almost 3 decades where you don't have a built-in kind of sense of nostalgia for these properties the way that, what surprised me last year was, all my students, who are first year, second year college students, 18 or 19, was seeing the nostalgia that they had for all the Marvel movies because they had grown up with them. So their whole movie going life, which I took for granted because I've enjoyed some of those Marvel movies and some I haven't. I'm not a huge fan of, some of them, and some I'm just sort of indifferent. I have kind of maybe the Martin Scorsese, response to a lot of them. They're just different. They're amusement rides, and sometimes they're pleasant, sometimes they're not. But I was hesitant to criticize them with so many of my students because their look of delight when Endgame was coming out last year was sort of moving. I mean, I just didn't realize or just ignored the fact that this is their childhood. I mean, the same way that I still respond to Star Wars because I saw it as it came out, was the way that they're responding to those films. So, to go back to the idea of nostalgia, that's what's driving it. I think, ironically enough, at least for me, with Shazam, there's just not enough of that nostalgia present for the character. It is a blank slate for whatever they want to do with it.
Yeah. Yeah, and so that combination of Shazam not being particularly well known, as we said when we started this conversation, and also possibly not having to pay any rights because it's based on the more recent...
notice, like you said, it's only Beck. It's only Binder's name is not on the film at all. It's only Beck and Bill Parker. Their names are on it, but that's in terms of the main sort of created by byline. I think I remember at the end of it seeing Jerry Ordway's name and Roy Thomas's name. I think is at the end, since they must have based taking some elements from those comics from the 80s and 90s. But sure, I'm sure that's a part of it too. That's a relatively cheap character, I imagine, for them.
Yeah, I would want to quickly, I think we're coming close to time now, but I would quickly like to touch on your impressions of how the recent Star Wars films have used nostalgia, because I kind of felt they were slathering it on a bit thick in the last one. What did you
I agree.
take away from that?
I have an odd relationship to the whole franchise because I think I maybe was 5 when I saw the first one. If it came out in 70, so I was almost 5, or saw it, in 78 when I would have turned that age. And remember being really excited for Empire Strikes Back when it came out in 1980. I have vivid memories of, looking forward to that with other friends of mine, which I guess we would have been in kindergarten or first grade. And then being very disappointed by Return of the Jedi, and I was not a huge fan of the prequels, but I will still go to them on the day that they open because I still have that kind of nostalgic connection to them. But as you just said, I think they overdid it with this last one, and I don't, because I enjoyed the Last Jedi. I thought it sort of resisted some of that nostalgizing in a really interesting way, and I found myself enjoying it as much as I had Empire, if they are supposed to be sort of twin films, which I've read some folks say in terms of how they line up with the original, or the middle 3, I guess. Yeah. But with this new one, it felt kind of empty. I felt in Last Jedi, with the introduction of particularly the Rose character, for me was almost like the Billy Batson in that film, like the younger character, the younger person that steps into this world and is sort of then sucked into it. So I think the fact that she's not, was not used in the more recent one took that away from me, because I personally love that sequence when they're on the gambling planet, in Last Jedi, and she has this great adventure, which she probably dreams that she never would have had, and I felt like that had that kind of resonance with what I like about the Captain Marvel, the characters, and that was sort of gone in this most recent film, so I was disappointed in that.
Yeah, and I think you've made an excellent comparison there by citing Billy Batson, because the gambling scene that everyone dismisses, and I also enjoyed it because I thought the point of that scene is you're fighting your Star Wars, you're going good and evil and all these big battles, and meanwhile these folks in this casino are just making money off all of you. Like, it doesn't matter who wins. They're still going to have a good time. But the fact that Rose takes all of this in and then turns to Finn and gives this speech about where she comes from and the suffering she's experienced and the hardship her family have experienced, and that he's completely unaware of that. And Billy as well comes from utter he's had no opportunity. He's an orphan. He lived on the streets. He was selling newspapers, all this kind of stuff. He was trying to make a quick buck, the original Billy Batson. I thought there was something quite poignant there, and just the way you framed the comparison.
Yeah, because then that's the element of what works so well with the original stories. Beck always said that they were he didn't think of them as being like the other comics, that they were boys' adventure stories, and substitute for that, like just children's adventure stories. That's why I think Last Jedi worked. I think that's why the original Star Wars films, which Beck admired, or he mentions that in one interview from the 80s, they have that kind of quality where you can imagine yourself into those worlds, even if there are parts of them that are scary, and they kind of navigate your way out of them. I think the Little Women, the Greta Gerwig film, which I love, is probably one of my favorite films from last year, has that same quality, maybe because I think of Little Women as part of that sort of child adventure sort of narrative, of the 19th and early 20th century. And so that also had that kind of sense of nostalgia. But again, Gerwig was able to sort of flip it on its side because it's such a well-written script in that film.
Well, sir, maybe there was something I don't know if you noticed, but Freddie Freeman, as played by Jack Dylan Grazer, I think he might be your cinematic alter ego, because not only is he a big superhero fan, a big comics fan, we know from a line of dialogue that he has been researching peer-reviewed studies on superheroes. He has an academic inclination.
That's true. I forgot about that part of the film.
On that note, what are you working on at the moment in that space? Is there anything you'd like to give a shout out for the listeners in terms of your own work?
Sure. Yeah, sure. With my good friend and colleague Brandon Costello from Louisiana State University, and some of your listeners may know him from his work on Howard Chaykin. He did the recent monograph on Chaykin's work, and with Keanu Whitted was co-editor for Comics in the U.S. South. He and I we're in the last stage of the process now. Are working on a edited collection on the 80s comic scene and independent movement of the 1980s. So we've got a great lineup of writers from the U.S. and from Europe. So we've got a nice lineup of younger and older comic scholars writing about everything from ElfQuest and Neil the Horse, through some of the really independent early ninja sort of martial arts comics of the 80s. So it's been a great project, and we really wanted to try to do justice, to a period where that's largely reduced within comic studies and within fandom as being focused on Mouse, Watchmen, and Dark Knight. So 1986 is the Renaissance moment, and that's the narrative we've had for over 30 years. So this book is trying to show the greater diversity that was in those comics of the 80s, and the sort of interesting alternative futures, as one of our contributors calls it, that we could have had. That's a phrase I think Aaron Cashton uses in his essay, which is on Amethyst and some of those other DC books from the 80s. So we're excited. We're looking at an early spring 2021 pub date for that.
Fantastic. Are any of your contributors writing about the Nexus comic by Mike Barron and Steve Rude? Because that was always my...
No, especially because that one issue that comes with the Flexidisc, the record. It comes with a soundtrack.
Yes.
So that's also one of my favorites. No, there were certain books that we were sad nobody pitched us on, and that was definitely one of them. We actually got most of what we had hoped for, particularly when we got the Neil the Horse proposal from Maheen Ahmed, who's done a lot of good work on Vertigo and those comics. So we were happy to get Neil, but no, it would have been wonderful to have more on some of the first books. We do have a piece from Andy Kunke that's partly on Aztec Ace, if you remember that other first comic by Doug Mensch. Yep.
Yeah. Doug and I used to be friends on Facebook. I've left Facebook years ago, but I would occasionally send him messages in the middle of the night. Hey, this issue of Moon Knight, what were you trying to do?
Yes.
He always responded.
He was very supportive and helpful when Andy I think had a blast doing the research. I think in fact his first draft of it, you could tell his enthusiasm. He had gotten so many stories, I think from Doug. So he was very, very helpful. So that's been one of the exciting parts of putting this together. We have things like that, and then we have someone like Jose Alanis writing about Ms. Mystic and admitting that it's a terrible comic, not one of Neil Adams' best. But why is it an interesting, terrible comic? I showed another friend of mine the table of contents for the book, and he said, "Wow, you guys really have covered pretty much everything. These are not books I would have expected." And I said, "That's the point. We want to try to bring back what it actually was like to read comics in the U.S. at a pretty exciting period, in the late '80s." Which, as we said earlier, even with these films, with John's as the basis of them, there's still a hangover from that idea of the '80s as this, horrible, mature, grim and gritty, right, decade.
Yeah. That's the only bit people remember. They don't remember that there were comic creators doing quite aspirational stuff or very comedic stuff. And that's why I cited Nexus, because it had a blend of both. It could occasionally be. But I'm very excited to hear that you've got a piece on amethyst and the work in amethyst coming in there, because I think that's hugely underrated and really, really fascinating that I think there's creators now taking a look at rebooting it again and trying to bring it in line with more modern sensibilities, but still keeping that allusion to the classical run, that there's this idea this was a great comic that just maybe doesn't get remembered as much, but was very good at that time. Right.
That's what Aaron does a really nice job. If you remember some of those other comics like Amazing Man, we have Blair Davis did a piece on that, and that's another one from that period of DC that's overlooked and forgotten because it was the exact opposite of all those grim and gritty comics, and Amethyst was like that. Aaron also writes about I'm trying to remember the other books. He talks a lot about the books that Trina Robbins did.
Wow.
For if you remember Meet Misty. So, and that was one of our goals, is that we really wanted to have, and we turned down some proposals that were strong, but were too much about books that have been talked about a lot and have been studied or at least referred to in the histories, whereas you don't see something like the piece we have from Isabelle Lecarrier-Goyem is on ElfQuest, and it's an amazing study not only of the importance of the series as an indie comic, but also of Wendy Peeney's real genius work as an artist, because she often gets overlooked as really an inheritor of someone like Beck, that clean line, very elegant kind of style. So Isabel has done a nice job. That's actually the essay that opens the book is the ElfQuest one, because we thought that would be the best way to start, because it brings in so many of those themes, including her use of the manga as a source. We start to see more of in the 80s, which is more what I write about. I talk about Reggie Byers, who worked for Comico and a lot of the Robotech titles, but then with other friends of his from Philly, speaking of Philadelphia, put together one of the an early all African American comics press with the money that he had made from working on Robotech for Comico, and then was introducing these manga drawing styles to readers. So there was an interesting mashup, and those are the stories we forget because, again, we're so fixated usually on The Dark Knight and Mouse and those books, which are understandably important, but not the whole story of that period.
Yeah, I kind of feel like comic scholarship has been astroturfed by all these accounts of The Dark Knight and Watchmen. If you keep coming back to, it's like these layers that are burying everything else that was there at that time, because everyone wants to have their two sights on these pivotal works, which means the conversation then solely about these pivotal works as opposed to whatever else was going on.
Right, exactly. And you don't see what was in parallel. Yeah, no, we're very excited, and we think our contributors have been fantastic, and we think it'll really make that kind of contribution, and hopefully also be of interest to people outside of comic studies, because we have quite a few contributors that just place it in the context of what else is happening, globally and socially and politically, not just within the world of comics. So it's I think it's a good balance.
Fantastic. I'm really looking forward to read. That sounds great. All right, Brian, thank you so much for taking the time. Listeners, it is Valentine's Day when we're talking, so I really appreciate you taking the time.
No problem.
Where can people find you online? Where would you point people to?
See, well, my online presence now is really down to Instagram. I still have my blog, which is brianwcremins.wordpress.com. The new album that my partner Allison Felix and I is up on SoundCloud, so we have that. The album is called American Romantic Music. I need to get you a copy. We're going to have a CD run done, or I'll send you a download code. But that's some work we did. We did that in the last year or so after doing the soundtrack for Gene Canterbury's Ischemic comic codex. So this is sort of our follow-up. It's not story-based as that was, and it's not a suite of music. It's just 8 or 9 separate songs we've been working on for the last couple of years.
Brilliant. Wow, that's so cool. Great stuff. Well, folks, as always, thanks for listening. Thanks, Brian, again, for taking the time to talk about Shazam and Captain Marvel. And see you again.
Thanks to Emmet and Brian for this week's episode. Support this and all our shows by joining us on Patreon. Our tiers start at just $2 a month. Pledge at least $4 a month to get our Patreon-only series Spider-Man 1963 and Tim Catches Up with the MCU, where last Saturday we released our review of Captain Marvel. Really, our second review. We discussed it once before in Critiquing Comics 154, and Mulele had some problems with it while I found it enjoyable. How have our thoughts about it evolved almost a year later? Support us on Patreon to hear our second look at the film. At $4, you can also get opportunities to participate in the show. Go to patreon.com/deconcomics to join the fun. Our theme is from bensound.com. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and Mulele and I will critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read at least 30 pages of it and critique it on the show. A new Critiquing Comics is coming up this Saturday. And next week, Kumar and Dana will be here, discussing Junji Ito's horror manga, Uzumaki. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.